$200. That was everything Walter Briggs had left in the world that he could call his own. It was folded into a worn envelope in the inside pocket of his coat, and it was supposed to last him the rest of the month. And on a cold gray morning in November, a 71-year-old retired police officer stood in the gravel lot of a rundown rescue kennel 200 miles from his home, and got ready to spend every last cent of it. He had driven through the night to get there. His old truck did not like the cold, and neither did his back, and he had stopped twice to rest his eyes and once to breathe through a pain in his chest that he chose not to think too hard about. But he had kept driving, because 3 days earlier a photograph had come across his computer screen that had stopped his heart, and because there was one thing left undone in Walter Briggs's life, one debt he had been carrying for 6 long years, and he had realized, looking at that photograph, that he might finally have the chance to pay it. The photograph was of a dog. An old German shepherd, gray in the muzzle, thin, with sad and cloudy eyes, sitting in a concrete kennel run at a rescue that took in the animals nobody else would. The listing said he was elderly, that he had health issues, that he was likely unadoptable, and that his time was running short. And Walter Briggs had looked at that photograph and made a sound like he had been struck. Because he knew that dog. He had known that dog since he was a puppy. That dog had once saved his life. That dog had been his partner, his shadow, the finest police dog the county had ever seen. His name was Ranger, and 6 years ago Walter Briggs had been forced to give him up, and he had regretted it every single day since. Now the old dog was at the end of his road in a kennel 200 miles away, and Walter Briggs had $200 in his coat and a truck that barely ran, and he had come to bring his partner home. What happened when they finally opened that kennel door is a thing the volunteers at that rescue still cannot talk about without stopping to collect themselves. It wrecked every heart and soul in that. And it is one of the most beautiful things I have ever had the privilege to tell you about. So stay with me all the way to the end. Because this is a story about an old man, an old dog, a last $200, and a debt of love that 6 years and 200 miles could not erase. To understand what that reunion meant, you have to understand what Walter Briggs and Ranger had been to each other, back when they were both young and strong and the best in the business. Walter had been a K-9 officer for most of his career, and he had handled several dogs over the years, all of them good. But every handler, if he is honest, will tell you there was one. One dog above all the others, the once-in-a-lifetime partner, the one who fit him like his own right hand. For Walter Briggs, that dog was Ranger. They had been paired when Ranger was barely more than a pup, and something between them clicked from the very first day, the way it does sometimes, rare and unmistakable. Walter used to say that he never really trained Ranger so much as the two of them learned to think with one mind. On the job, Walter barely had to give a command. A glance, a shift of weight, a quiet word, and the dog was already moving, already knowing. They worked the toughest calls in the county for years, and Ranger was fearless and brilliant and utterly, completely devoted to the man at the other end of his lead. And once, Ranger did the thing that binds a handler to his dog forever. He saved Walter's life. It was a night that Walter did not talk about much, a warrant that went wrong, a man in the dark who meant to do him harm. And Ranger, without a half-second of hesitation, put himself between his handler and the danger, and took the worst of it, and gave Walter the seconds he needed to survive. The dog carried a scar from that night for the rest of his life, a patch of fur that never grew back quite right along his shoulder. Walter used to rest his hand on that scar sometimes, in the quiet years that followed, and he never said anything when he did it, but he did not have to. They were, in every way that matters, one soul and two bodies. And then life did the thing that life does. It came between them. The end of their partnership was not dramatic. That was almost the worst of it. It was just paperwork and bad timing, and the ordinary machinery of the world grinding forward without any regard for the hearts caught in its gears. Walter's wife, Eleanor, fell ill. It was serious, and it was long, and it required him to leave the department earlier than he had planned, to be home, to care for her. And there was a rule, in that department in those days, a rule that has since changed in most places but was ironclad then. A working dog belonged to the department, not the handler. When Walter retired, Ranger was still a young, fit, capable animal, still in his prime, with years of good service left in him. And the department was not about to let a valuable working dog retire early just because his handler had to. They reassigned him to a new handler. It was, by the cold logic of the institution, the correct decision. And it broke two hearts at once. Walter fought it. He begged. He offered to buy the dog outright. But the rules were the rules, and Ranger was needed, and in the end there was nothing Walter Briggs could do but hand over the lead to a younger man and walk away. He always said afterward that it was the hardest thing he ever did, harder than anything the job had ever asked of him. He turned and walked to his truck, and he did not let himself look back, because he knew that if he saw Ranger straining after him, he would not be able to bear it. And behind him, he heard the dog begin to cry. That sound followed Walter Briggs for 6 years. It followed him into his sleep. He told himself the dog would be fine. He told himself a working dog is resilient, that Ranger would bond with his new handler, that it was for the best. And he went home to care for his dying wife, and he did his duty there too, faithfully, to the very end, and he lost her, and he grieved her, and through all of it, underneath all of it, there was a second, quieter grief that never went away. The grief of a partner he had abandoned. The sound of a dog crying after him in a parking lot. The years were not kind to Walter Briggs after Eleanor died. He was alone in a way he had never been. His pension was small, and the medical bills from Eleanor's long illness had eaten through their savings, and he lived carefully, frugally, in the little house they had shared, growing older and quieter and more solitary. He was not bitter. That was not in his nature. But the light had gone out of things. He kept the house clean and he kept himself fed and he went to the same diner on Sunday mornings, and he was, if anyone had asked, simply waiting. An old man running out the clock. He thought about Ranger often. He wondered what had become of him. He assumed the dog had lived a good working life and then a good retirement somewhere, and he hoped that whoever had him loved him, and he tried not to think about it too much, because it hurt in a place that did not heal. He had no idea what had actually happened. Because Ranger's story after Walter left was not the story Walter had told himself. The new handler had been a decent enough man, but he and Ranger never truly bonded, not the way Walter and Ranger had, and how could they? When Ranger finally aged out of service, he did not go to a warm retirement with a loving family. He was passed along. And then, as he got older and his health began to fail and he became less and less convenient, he was passed along again. An old dog with medical needs is a hard thing to place. He moved from home to home, each one a little less invested than the last, until finally, elderly and ailing and bewildered, he ended up surrendered to a rescue 200 miles from the only man he had ever truly loved. Labeled unadoptable. Running out of time. And that is where a photograph of him, posted online by a volunteer hoping against hope to find him a soft place to die, crossed the computer screen of a retired police officer one gray afternoon in November. Walter knew him instantly. 6 years. A gray muzzle. Cloudy eyes. A body worn thin by age and hard travel. And Walter Briggs knew that dog in less than a second, the way you would know your own child in a crowd of thousands, and the recognition hit him so hard that he had to sit down. He looked closer at the photograph, his hands shaking, and there it was. Along the shoulder. A patch of fur that had never grown back quite right. The scar from a night in the dark, years ago, when a young dog had thrown himself in front of a bullet meant for his handler. It was Ranger. After all these years, after everything, it was Ranger, and he was alive, and he was 200 miles away, and he was almost out of time. Walter Briggs did not hesitate. He called the rescue that same afternoon. He told them, in a voice that kept breaking, that he knew that dog, that he had been that dog's original handler, that the dog had once saved his life. The volunteer on the phone, a kind woman named Sarah, was cautious at first, the way people at rescues learn to be. But there was something in the old man's voice, and she listened, and by the end of the call she was crying too. There was a fee, she explained, gently. Not much, for a dog in Ranger's condition. $200, to cover the medical care they had already put into him. She said it almost apologetically. She would have waived it if she could, she said, but the rescue ran on nothing and every dollar kept another animal alive. $200. Walter Briggs looked at the worn envelope in the drawer where he kept the cash that was supposed to get him through to the end of the month. $200, more or less. Everything he had that was truly his own until the next small pension check came in. He did not think about it for even a moment. "I'll be there tomorrow," he said. "Please. Please don't let anything happen to him. I'm coming to get my partner." And he got in his old truck that did not like the cold, and he drove through the night. The volunteers at that rescue did not quite know what to make of him when he pulled into the gravel lot the next morning. They saw an old man, clearly not wealthy, clearly not well, who had driven all night and looked like he might fall over. They saw the worn coat and the truck held together with hope. And when he came into the little office and took out a worn envelope and counted $200 onto the counter in small, soft, carefully kept bills, several of them understood, without being told, that they were watching a man spend everything he had. Sarah, the volunteer who had spoken to him on the phone, tried one more time. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "you don't have to. Not all of it. We can work something out. A dog his age, with his health, I don't want you to, ma'am," Walter said, and his voice was very quiet and very firm. "That dog took a bullet for me. He spent 6 years wondering where I went. I'm not going to stand here and haggle over what he's worth." He pushed the money gently across the counter. "This is the easiest $200 I've ever spent in my life. Now please, take me to my partner." Nobody argued with him after that. They walked him back through the kennels, past run after run of barking, hopeful, forgotten dogs, and Walter's chest was tight, and his hands would not stop shaking, and he was afraid, suddenly, terribly afraid. 6 years. Would the dog even know him? An old man is not the man he was. Time changes a face, a walk, a voice. What if Ranger had forgotten him? What if all that was left was a confused old dog who looked at a stranger with no recognition at all? Walter was not sure his heart could survive that. He almost stopped walking. And then they came around the last corner, to the run at the very end, and there he was. Ranger was lying in the back of the concrete run, curled up small against the cold, his gray head down on his paws. He looked so old. He looked so tired. He was thin and stiff, and there was a cloudiness in his eyes now, and he did not lift his head when the little group of humans approached, because old surrendered dogs learn that approaching humans are usually nothing to get up for. Walter Briggs stood at the gate of that run and looked at his old partner, and he could not speak. His throat had closed completely. Tears were running down the deep lines of his face into his gray stubble, and he did not wipe them away. And then, in a voice that shook so badly it was barely a whisper, Walter said the only thing he could get out. He said the old dog's name, the way he used to say it, a lifetime ago, in a parking lot, at the end of a shift. "Ranger," he whispered. "Hey. Hey, buddy. It's me." The old dog's ears moved first. Just his ears. A twitch. And then, as if he did not dare to believe it, as if the sound had reached down through 6 years and 200 miles and all the homes and all the forgetting to touch something that had never, ever died. Ranger lifted his gray head off his paws. He looked at the old man standing at the gate. His cloudy eyes found him. And for one endless heartbeat, nothing happened, and Walter's heart stood still in his chest, certain he was about to have it confirmed that he was a stranger. And then Ranger came apart. The volunteers who were there say they will never, as long as they live, forget the sound that old dog made. It started as a whine and rose into something none of them had a word for, a high, cracking, disbelieving cry, and that ancient, stiff, ailing animal that had not gotten up for anyone in weeks scrambled to his feet, his back legs sliding under him, and he threw himself at the gate of that run. He was crying, openly, the way a dog almost never does, a sound of pure and total joy tearing out of a body far too old and too tired to contain it, and he pressed himself against the bars and shoved his whole gray muzzle through them toward the old man, frantic to reach him, and his tail was going so hard his whole failing body swung with it. He knew him. Across 6 years and everything the world had done to him, that dog knew him instantly and completely. His man had come back. His man had finally come back. They got the gate open and Walter Briggs went down onto his knees on the cold concrete floor, an old man with a bad back and a worse heart. He just went straight down, and Ranger flung himself into his arms. The old dog buried his face in Walter's neck and cried, and Walter wrapped both arms around him and pressed his face into that gray fur and cried too, and the two of them knelt there on the floor of that kennel and held onto each other and shook, 6 years of grief and longing and loss pouring out of both of them at once. And every hardened volunteer in that, people who had seen 1,000 sad things and learned to armor themselves against all of it, stood in that hallway and completely fell apart. Sarah had to leave the room. A man who had worked at that rescue for a decade turned and put his hand against the wall and wept. Because you cannot watch a thing like that. You cannot watch an old man spend his last $200 and drive through the night to kneel on a concrete floor and be recognized, after 6 years, by a dying dog who never stopped waiting for him. It is more than a human heart is built to hold. Walter kept saying it into the dog's fur, over and over, his voice broke into pieces. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, buddy. I'm sorry I left. I'm sorry it took me so long. I've got you now. I've got you. You're coming home. And Ranger, who could not understand a single word, understood all of it, and pressed closer, and would not let go. Walter Briggs carried his partner out of that rescue in his own arms, all 200 miles of longing at an end, and he laid him gently on a folded blanket on the passenger seat of his old truck, and he drove them home. And this is the part one have to be honest with you about, because I have promised you the truth in these stories and I will not break that promise now. Ranger was old, and Ranger was sick, and the time they had was not long. The years of hard travel and neglect had taken their toll, and no amount of love could give an old dog back the springtime of his life. Walter knew it. He had known it, in a way, from the moment he saw the photograph. He had not driven through the night and spent his last dollar because he believed he was going to get years. He had done it because his partner was going to die, and Walter Briggs was not going to let him die in a concrete kennel, alone, wondering where his man had gone. He had come to make sure that Ranger died home. Died loved. Died knowing. And so the last chapter of Ranger's long life was the best one. However short it was the best one. For the time they had, that old dog lived like a king. Walter spent money he did not really have on soft beds and good food and the medicines that kept his old partner comfortable. They spent their days together in the little house, the old man and the old dog, never more than a room apart. Ranger followed Walter everywhere, and stiff and content, and at night he slept pressed against the side of Walter's bed, where the old man could reach down in the dark and rest his hand on that shoulder, on the scar that never grew back right, the way he used to, a lifetime ago. They were not two lonely creatures running out the clock anymore. They were together. And for both of them, after 6 long years apart, Together was the only thing either one of them had ever really wanted. Walter said, later, that those were among the happiest weeks of his whole life. He said the grief that had sat on him since Eleanor died had lifted, just a little, just enough. He said that having something to care for again, having his old friend back, had given him a reason to get up in the morning that he had not had in years. Two broken-down old veterans, keeping each other company at the end of the road. Neither one of them alone anymore. When the time finally came for Ranger, it came the way it should, the way it so rarely gets to. He was old, and he was warm, and he was home, and he was loved beyond measure. And he was not alone, not for 1 second of it. Walter Briggs sat on the floor beside his partner's bed, the way he had knelt on the concrete floor of that kennel weeks before, and he held that gray head in his lap, and he stroked the scar on that old shoulder, and he talked to him low and gentle, telling him what a good boy he was, what a good partner, the best there ever was, the best there ever was. And Ranger slipped away peacefully, without fear, without pain, with his head in the hands of the one man he had loved his whole long life, the man who would come back for him at the very end, the way he had always, somewhere in his faithful heart, believed he would. He did not die in a kennel, forgotten. He died home. Walter Briggs buried his partner in the yard of the little house, under a tree where the morning sun came through, and he made a small marker for him, and on it he had them carved just 3 words, the truest 3 words he knew. He came back. And people were not sure, when they read it, whether Walter meant the dog or himself. In the end, of course, it was both. Walter did not have as many years left himself as he might have liked. That chest pain he had chosen not to think about on the long drive was not nothing, and he knew it. But he always said that the $200 and the 200 miles were the best decision he ever made, and that he would have made the drive if it had been his very last act on this earth. And in a way, it saved him too. The people at that rescue never forgot him, and they kept in touch, and Sarah in particular checked in on the old man from time to time. And when they saw how the whole thing had brought him back to life, even for a little while, they asked him, gently, if he might want to help. If he might consider fostering other old dogs, unadoptable dogs, dogs at the end of the road who needed a soft place to land. And Walter Briggs, who had spent his last $200 and thought he had nothing left to give, discovered that he had a great deal left to give after all. He spent the last years of his own life doing the one thing that had brought him back from the dead. He took in the old ones. The dying ones. The ones nobody wanted. One after another, he gave them warm beds and good food in gentle hands, and a home to die in, so that not one of them had to go the way Ranger had so nearly gone, alone on cold concrete, wondering if anybody would ever come. He could not save the young ones or fix the sick ones. But he could make sure that at the very end, they were not alone. He could make sure that somebody came back for them. He said Ranger taught him that. He said he owed it to Ranger. And every single one of those old dogs, at the end of their road, got to feel what Ranger felt in that kennel hallway. The impossible, overwhelming joy of being chosen. Of being wanted. Of being, against all odds, at long last, brought home. So that is the story of an old officer, his last $200, and the partner he drove through the night to bring home. Of everything in it, here is the part one carry with me. It is that moment at the gate. It is an old man, terrified, standing at the door of a concrete run, so afraid that 6 years had erased him, that his partner would look up and see only a stranger. And it is that old dog lifting his gray head, and knowing him. Knowing him instantly. Because that, in the end, is the miracle these creatures work on us. 6 years. 100 miles of forgetting. Home after home that let him down. And none of it, not one day of it, had touched the place where that dog kept his love for one man. It was exactly where he left it. It had been waiting the whole time. We spend so much of our lives believing that we have missed our chance. That too much time has passed. That the door we should have walked through was closed for good, that the debt we should have paid can never be paid now, that it is simply too late. Walter Briggs believed that for 6 years. He believed his partner was gone, that the moment had passed, that there was nothing to be done. And he was wrong. It was not too late. It was very nearly too late. But it was not too late. He drove through the night, and he spent his last dollar, and he got there just in time to give his old friend the one thing that mattered. A homecoming. A hand to die in. The knowledge that he had not been forgotten after all. If there is a debt of love in your life that you have been carrying, a person you have been meaning to go back to, an amends you have been telling yourself is too late to make, I am asking you, as someone who has watched too many chances close forever. Do not assume the door is shut. Make the drive. Spend the $200. Go back. It may be later than you would like. But it may not, yet, be too late. And there is nothing on this earth like the moment when the one you thought you had lost lifts their head, and knows you, and forgives you everything, all at once. If this story touched your heart, do me a kindness and leave a comment below. Tell me about a reunion you have had, or one you still hope for. Tell me about the best old dog you ever loved. I read every single one, and those comments are the whole reason I do this. And if you believe, the way I do, that the old ones and the forgotten ones deserve to be brought home, then give this video a like so more people get to hear Walter and Ranger's story, and share it with someone who needs the reminder today that it is not too late to go back. If you are new here, and you love true stories about loyalty, second chances, and the unbreakable bond between people and the dogs who never stop waiting for them, then subscribe and stay with us. Every week, I bring you another story, told all the way through, from beginning to end. Next time, I want to tell you about a retired police dog who broke away from his family in a crowded market and lay down on top of a complete stranger, refusing to move, and about what he alone had sensed that saved that stranger's life. Until then, go back for the ones you love, while there is still